Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and in this video, I'm going to try to explain how capitalism works through the eyes of eBay. so it's basically eBay explains capitalism. So the idea is this: I collect comics, and one of the things that I do is I sometimes buy comics not because I know anything about the comic. It's more because of spec. And spec is where you sort of want to buy a comic because later on you know that that comic's going to go up in value. It's sort of like an investment buy where maybe it's not worth that much right now, but that comic maybe 6 months from now or a year, there might be a movie coming out and that comic's going to shoot up in value. So if you buy it now, you can generally do well because you're buying it at the low price when its full price is really realized later on. Now, if you think about how employers and employees work, it's very similar, that it's a spec buy. So when an employer pays their employees, they don't really know if they're going to be able to sell that product that that employee produces and if it's going to make them money. And it's a sort of a spec. They think, oh, if I make this fidget spinner today and it costs me $10, I can sell it for 20, a year later. And sometimes that works and sometimes that fails. And it's a gamble. But the whole point is this, that the employer is making a spec buy where they're really guessing whether or not that investment of $20 or $10 will make them $20 later. So that's the basis behind a lot of what happens in the free market, that whole spec buy. And if you look at eBay, eBay is kind of like the marketplace of people, kind of similar in a lot of ways. And people always say, well, why does, under socialist ideas, you'd say, well, the employer just pays people the least that they can pay, the very least. And that, and they always think, oh, capitalism equals slavery because the least you can pay somebody is nothing. And that's the misconception that they have. And they don't understand that employers are actually competing for employees. And it's similar to eBay. So first of all, you have to understand that spec buy because that's really what employers are doing. But even more so, you have to understand the idea of comics. And the way comics work is there's only a certain number of comics in the world, just like there's only a certain number of people in the world. And if there's not enough people, like for example, one of the comics that I really want to buy is All-Star Comics number 8. That's the first appearance of Wonder Woman. Great comic. It's a great story too. It has like a whole bunch of cool things happening in the story. And it just happens that it has the first appearance of Wonder Woman in it. And it's a very old and rare comic. And because of that, people are willing to pay, way over what it's physically worth, material costs that have been put into that comic. Material costs are pretty low. It's like maybe it was sold originally for 10 cents. So if you think about it, material costs, according to Marx, right, would be nothing. It'd be like, 5 cents, 2 cents, I don't know, something very pathetic. But yet that comic, even the crappiest grade, like where it's all mangled, is, 10,000, 20,000. And if it's in the highest grade, it's worth like $1 million. So it's one of those ones where, it's people seeking it because it's rare, it's valuable, and there's that perceived value that, people can get from it. And that's what happens with employees. Now, if an employee is doing something which is a common task, like sweeping the floors, where anyone can do that, well, that's not going to really get that much interest. And many people can do that job. There's a lot of them. But if it's something where it's more rare, like a CEO is a really rare thing to find. Somebody that can work long hours, somebody that can make really tough decisions, somebody that can be responsible for whether or not the business succeeds or fails, somebody that can manage a great number of people, somebody that has insight into where the market is going, somebody that can do like a million different tasks. And it's really one of those things where that is a really rare commodity. And because it's a rare commodity, companies are willing to pay a lot for that, because it has so much value. And it's like that rare comic. It's a rare thing, so people are willing to pay more for it. And even within that, there's like different levels, how good they are. So sometimes they make and it's all spec buy. So you could buy a CEO if you think about buying it that way. And you think, oh, this CEO is going to be worth $1 million or $10 million or $100 million. And it turns out that CEO is worth maybe $5 million. It was a bad choice. You buy something at $100 million and it's worth $5 million. Oh, you screwed up. And that happens in business. There's a lot of spec buying when they try to get employees. But sometimes they do really well. And it's the opposite, where they pay them, $2 million and they turn out to be a really great CEO, and they end up, changing the way the company works, and the company becomes this massive company. And as a result, they could be worth $100 million, even though it only cost them $2 million. So that's the great thing about capitalism, that there's this whole market and there's a lot of spec buying happening. And a lot of people within the Marxist philosophy say, well, okay, if an employee produces something that's worth, and they're getting paid $10 and, all the costs associated, maybe cost $15. And then later on, the capitalist gets paid $20. Well, that's unfair because, he's getting paid more than all that associated cost to producing that product. But they don't understand the spec buy. And the spec buy is this, that the capitalist doesn't know. They're guessing, they're hoping that they'll make money, but they don't always know. There's that risk. And another thing that socialists don't really understand is that the reason most people, like I think it's like 97% of all jobs are non-minimum wage. So you'd think, oh, if employers are just trying to pay their employees the least that they could pay, everyone should be making minimum wage. But it doesn't happen that way because it's really these employers all competing. So if you're on eBay and you say, oh, I really want this one comic. Now there might be 100 copies on eBay. And generally what will happen is there'll be a whole bunch of people wanting to buy that comic because they're making the same spec buy that you are. And what you might have is, all these people competing to buy that comic. And the price goes from being $1 at first. It's like I can get it really cheaply. And then it goes to $2, $3. It keeps on going up, and it's like, oh no. And you try to get your bid in, you try to wait for the last second to get the lowest price on that comic. And you pay what ends up being the market price of that product. And it's the same with employees. That's why employees don't get paid the least amount. They get paid on what the market dictates. So, and the market is pretty savvy within the employment industry. People know how much a janitor is worth. Janitor is worth X dollars, and you can look it up. You can actually look it up because it's pretty common. And that actually happens with comics too. So in comics, we have what's called the price guide. And a price guide says this is how much this comic is worth. And it's sort of the market price for that year. Like it's usually, guides only come out once a year. And it's sort of like, what should that comic sell for? And people will go to the guide and they'll say, okay, this comic is worth $10. I'm not going to pay 15 because it's only worth $10. And then you go to eBay and you look for that comic and it's selling for $15. Because what's happening is people know the guide, they actually know that value, but there's still the competition for it. So the price changes. It actually can change from what even people say the guide is. Now the opposite can happen too, where that price goes below. And it's really a fair exchange, because if that person's willing to sell it below what the average or guide price is, well, that's their own decision. And if they're willing to, if they can get more, they will get more. Because what people don't realize is there's actually a competition that's happening on both ends. The employers are trying to get the best price for their employees, and the employees are trying to get the best price for their time, for their work. And they can shop around. And there is that supply and demand kind of thing where both sides are trying to get the best price from the other. And based on competition, the price gets to wherever it gets. Now, there is the guide price, and people will, when you come into a job situation, people will go in knowing the guide price, and even the job offer will have what's the guide price. They'll say, okay, this job is worth $40,000 a year, and the person will come in, and they know that there's competition, and they'll say, okay, I'll do it for $40,000. And then immediately, once they get the job, they'll say, well, can I get benefits? Can I get this? Can I get that? Where they can increase the value, even though they're, the price is actually supposed to be 40, but they'll try to increase the price that they get. And that's very normal. That's normal within business. I've had hundreds of employees over the years, and I've seen it over and over again, where the guide price is something, and the employee is always negotiating to try to get more. And that's part of business. That's part of the way capitalism works. The value that customers, but employees try to bring, and they always try to shift and say, hey, I'm worth more than this, and they always try to increase their value. And a good way back to comics, I love representing everything under comics, is to understand that, let's say you have a copy of a comic and the guide value is $10, but there's a grade within that. So if it's a mint copy, which is perfect, then it's worth $10. But if it's a crappy copy, where it's just beaten up, and maybe it's worth $1, okay? And it really is that kind of thing. And the way you can understand that is to understand that an employee can say, okay, I can do this job. And when they first start, they could be like that beaten up copy of the comic, because they don't know the job. They don't know how to work within that company. And they're really not producing much value, because they're just new to the job and new to that company. And even though they're doing the job that's worth $10, they might be only bringing $1 worth of value. But over time, they get better at it, and they can get to that $10 value, or maybe they can get way above that $10 value because they can get really good at it. And generally what ends up happening is that whole time when they're below actually their value, they're fine. They don't complain too much. But once they get to that value, that's when they say, oh, wait, I really should be getting paid more because I'm doing so much more for the company. And generally then there's a renegotiation, and you end up paying that employee more, because they know that if they've increased their value enough, they can easily shift to another company, and that other company will be willing to pay them more. And the market's always changing. So, as an employer, you have to be sort of used to that, where these employees are constantly changing their value, whether, it's based on their productivity or based on their experience. There's things that they can do that shifts their value. And this is the cool thing about capitalism, that you never know where it's going to go. And it can go the opposite way too, where employees can actually reduce their value over time. I've seen that a lot, where you get somebody that's really gung-ho, and they're really awesome. Actually, they have more value than you would expect, and you actually increase their salary because you reward them for that good attitude. But then, for whatever reason, they get lazy, and their value actually drops. But it's really hard to lower somebody's salary. That's kind of one of the risks that you run with business. It's easy to increase somebody's salary, but it's really hard to lower somebody's salary. And usually what ends up happening is you actually have to fire that person because they've increased their salary so much, but then they've over time, for whatever reason, they reduce their value. They're getting lazy. They're just not working very hard. They just don't care about the job for whatever reason. And, you try to incentivize you try to you do, I do things like I have I take my employees and put them give them a vacation, like a real vacation, like where they got to go somewhere. And I do all these things to try to make my employees happy so that they don't lose that motivation. But sometimes all of that doesn't work. And for whatever reason, the employee gets lazy, they start screwing up, and they reduce their value. And that's the risk. That's the risk that employers take. And it's back to the same thing with eBay, that, you buy something, you think it's going to be a really great thing, but for whatever reason, it just isn't. Just the value, it's sort of like with back to comics again. I love comics. What happens is if you buy a comic, for example, I know that the new Black Widow movie is going to come out. So sometimes there's a lot of people speculating, oh, this is going to be a really big movie. It's going to make the character really, really popular. So they all invest and buy that first appearance of Black Widow. And what happens is the value goes way up. And so because everyone's competing for that product, for that comic. And what ends up happening is, though, the movie comes out. It's an okay movie, whatever, it does okay. And then after, like a few months after the movie's over, like from being in the theaters, people get bored of it. They're like, oh, okay, not so interesting anymore. And the value of that comic goes from being spiked to being very low. So it's like you get the spike and then it drops down again. Now, if they make another movie, it keeps on kind of going up and down like that, where it's kind of like this spike, drop, spike, drop, but it's sort of an upward trend. And that, that's sort of typical. Well, that's what happens with employees too, that, it can go up and down, but you hope the trend is upwards. And, and you hope that you're buying on the low and not on the spike. So that's one of the tricks too. But the point is, as an employee, you actually are pretty protected because you're getting paid regardless of whether or not that employer made the right spec buy. And that's the really big thing that most people don't understand. Most people don't appreciate that spec buy, that the employer is really making a decision based on the future and hoping that they can guess the future correctly. Like, it's sort of like, if you bought Cineplex. Cineplex is a big movie theater chain in Canada. And it was last year, if you looked at their stock, it was like just going up. And there was companies that wanted to buy out Cineplex because it was just such a great buy. It was just doing extremely well. Well, now we have this crisis, and that same company that was soaring at the top of the stock market is now floundering. It has real problems because they can't run their movie theaters. So, things change, and the CEO and the entrepreneur, the business owner, has to be able to see those changes before they happen. It's pretty impossible. Sometimes they guess right, sometimes they guess wrong. And that's the real thing that Marx didn't understand, because he had this sort of this labor value kind of concept where he saw things and he didn't understand that the fluidity of the market and how things constantly are changing. And that's why planned economies never work, because there's no way to see that, there's no way to understand, because it's sort of like the butterfly effect. Like if you're trying to guess the market, you're trying to guess where every butterfly in the world is, really, because little things can make huge impacts on the market. And I'm not even joking about that. The virus is a little thing that had a huge impact on the market. And it made the market go all over the place. It sort of picked winners and losers in the market. So little things can have huge impact, and trying to guess all those little things and to see all those things in the future, impossible. That's why a planned economy never works. That's why the invisible hand is so powerful as a concept from Adam Smith, because there's no way to predict all these things. So when you're looking at eBay, try to see it as a market, and it is a market. It's a market of whatever products you want to buy, but we got to understand that that's what happens between employers and employees. The same relationship, that the prices can go all over the place. Some days it's high, some days it's low, depending on what the needs are. And it's really important to understand this, because too often people make the assumption that, oh, those evil employers, they're just ripping off the employees. They're if you read any Marx, it's almost like the employers are just these evil people who are like barely paying their employees, and it's just really not true. It's just not how it works, and it's really a very spec buy kind of situation where employers are really trying to make, they're trying to pay the least amount, whereas the people that are selling their services are trying to get the most. And that's really what's happening. And sometimes the employees win, sometimes the employers win. And it's not really a battle between the two, because what ends up happening is actually they both end up winning in their own minds. Because, sometimes the employees will generally win, and sometimes the employers will generally win. And they both feel like they are happy because they're winning enough of the time that it sort of balances out all the losses. So that's, I don't know if this analogy really works. I hope it does. And if you have an All-Stars number 8, please send it my way. Yeah, that's been Socially Triggered. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope the eBay analogy works for you, and tell me what you think. Show me where my logic is maybe flawed in the comments below, and check out my other videos. I'm going to do another video as well on kind of maybe explaining what the benefits are for the employee versus what the benefits are for the employer within the working relationship. And I kind of want to show you that as well. And I really want to get rid of this Marxist notion that that capitalism is slavery, because it's just such a misnomer. It just doesn't even make sense. Adam Smith himself said that slavery was a useless industry, and it's capitalism is about actually freeing people and giving them the ability to properly get real value for their labor. So just like eBay is a great place for you trying to get the real value of your comics. So I hope that makes sense. So thanks for watching.